2 years, 730 days. That is how long Daniel Carter searched for his 5-year-old son. Police searched the rivers. Volunteers searched the forests. Detectives searched abandoned buildings, storage units, and the backs of vans belonging to men who had no connection to the case at all. They searched until there was nothing left to search. And they found nothing. Until one rainy Tuesday night, in the second week of October, Daniel's phone made a sound he had never heard before. A small, flat chime. Almost gentle. The kind of sound you'd miss if the television was on. He almost did miss it. He was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, staring at a photograph he'd looked at 10,000 times before. A boy in a red raincoat, missing his front tooth, laughing at something just out of frame. When the phone chimed, Daniel didn't recognize the sound at first. It took him a moment to realize it was an app. An old app, one he'd installed years ago and forgotten about, back when a friend at work convinced the whole office to buy little Bluetooth tracking tags for their car keys, their wallets, their kids' backpacks. He picked up the phone. The screen was glowing with a single notification. Device found. Ethan's backpack tag distance. 6 feet location. Home. For a moment, Daniel didn't breathe. 6 feet. Not 6 miles. Not 600 miles. 6 feet inside his own house. He stood up so fast the chair scraped backward across the floor and toppled. He didn't stop to pick it up. He walked down the hallway, past the bathroom, past the hall closet, until he reached the door that had stayed closed more often than open for 2 years. Ethan's door, the one with a faded dinosaur sticker peeling at one corner. He pushed it open. The room was exactly as it had been the day Ethan vanished. The bed was made with a blue comforter covered in cartoon rockets. A stuffed rabbit sat propped against the pillow, its fur slightly gray with dust nobody had the heart to clean. Nobody had touched this room in 2 years. Not really. Sarah dusted the shelves sometimes. Out of some need neither of them could explain, but the bed had not been slept in, not been sat on, not been so much as leaned against since the morning Ethan left for kindergarten and never came home. Daniel looked down at his phone again. Distance, 3 feet. He knelt down. His hand was shaking so badly he almost dropped the phone. He looked under the bed. And that is where our story begins. Not with an ending, but with a question that would keep an entire town awake for months to come. How could a tracking signal suddenly appear after 2 years of complete silence? And why would the single biggest clue in the entire investigation be hiding in the one place police had already searched 3 separate times? To understand what Daniel found under that bed, you first need to understand who Ethan Carter was and everything his family lost the day he disappeared. Before any of this happened, the Carters were, by every outward measure, an ordinary family living an ordinary life in a small town where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Daniel Carter worked as a project estimator for a construction firm. He was the kind of father who showed up early to every school event, who kept a mental log of his son's favorite snacks, who could recite entire picture books from memory because he'd read them aloud so many times. Sarah Carter taught piano lessons out of their living room 3 afternoons a week. She had a laugh that carried through the house, the kind of laugh that made neighbors smile just hearing it through an open window. And then there was Ethan. Ethan Carter was 5 years old, and he was, according to everyone who knew him, a small burst of chaos wrapped in a blue raincoat. He loved dinosaurs, he loved puddles, and he loved asking why until the adults around him ran out of answers. He had just lost his first tooth 2 weeks before he disappeared, and he showed it off to anyone who would look, pulling his lip back with his fingers and grinning like he'd discovered gold. Every weekday morning, Sarah walked him 3 blocks to Maple Grove Kindergarten, a small brick building with cheerful yellow curtains in every window. Ethan liked to count the cracks in the sidewalk on the way. He always stopped at the same crack, the one shaped, he insisted, like a dinosaur footprint, and stomped on it for luck. It was a small town, a safe town, the kind of place where people still left their front doors unlocked. That illusion of safety would not survive the week. Everything changed on one ordinary Thursday morning in September, a morning that looked, in every visible way, exactly like every morning before it. The morning began the way it always did. Ethan woke up complaining about his socks. Sarah made him scrambled eggs, which he ate exactly 4 bites of before declaring himself full. Daniel kissed the top of his head on his way out the door to work, told him to be good, and promised to take him to the park that weekend to look for real dinosaur footprints, a promise Ethan held him to with the seriousness of a legal contract. At 8:15 a.m., Sarah walked Ethan to Maple Grove Kindergarten. He stomped on his lucky crack in the sidewalk, same as always. At the classroom door, his teacher, Ms. Bennett, greeted him with the same warm smile she gave every child, checked his name off the attendance sheet, and watched him run to join his friends at the reading corner. The classroom security camera, a single unit mounted above the door, more for insurance purposes than anything else, recorded him walking in at 8:19 a.m. He was smiling. He was carrying his small dinosaur backpack, the one with a tag sewn into the strap that Daniel had insisted on adding after a co-worker's story about a lost child years earlier. The morning passed the way mornings always did. Circle time, a story about a caterpillar. Snack time, where Ethan traded his crackers for a friend's fruit cup. A negotiation Ms. Bennett noted later with a small, sad smile, because it was one of the last completely normal memories anyone had of him. At noon, the children went out to the playground for 20 minutes before lunch. And at 12:20 p.m., when the teacher's aide did her routine head count to bring the children back inside, Ethan Carter was not there. No alarm had gone off. No fence had been breached. No gate stood open. There had been no scream, no struggle, nothing that any of the 11 other children on that playground remembered seeing or hearing. One moment, there were 17 children on the playground. The next, there were 16. Nobody could explain it. Not the aide, not the teacher, not the principal, who was called within minutes, and who, in turn, called the police at 12:31 p.m., 11 minutes after the last confirmed sighting of Ethan Carter, laughing on the swings. Sarah arrived at pickup at 3 p.m. to be met by 2 police officers standing in the school lobby. And in that instant, before a single word was spoken, she understood that her life had just been divided into 2 permanent halves, before and after. Police pulled every camera in the building, every hallway camera, every entrance camera, every camera in the parking lot. And in the footage from a playground camera, the one angle that should have shown exactly what happened, investigators found something that made even the most experienced detectives on the case go quiet. For 4 minutes and 12 seconds, the footage was there, and then it simply wasn't. The gap in the footage lasted exactly 4 minutes and 12 seconds, beginning at 12:16 p.m. and ending at 12:20 p.m., the exact window in which Ethan vanished. The school's IT contractor insisted this was nothing more than a known glitch in an aging DVR system, the kind of corrupted frame dropout that happened during storage overwrites. Investigators weren't convinced it was that simple, but for the moment, they had no evidence to say otherwise. It was, on paper, an explainable malfunction. In practice, it was the worst possible coincidence, a hole in the one piece of evidence that could have shown, second by second, exactly what happened to a 5-year-old boy. What followed was one of the largest searches the county had ever mounted. Search dogs combed every wooded lot within a 2-mile radius. Divers checked the creek that ran behind the elementary school. Helicopters with thermal imaging flew over farmland at night for the first 3 days. Volunteers, hundreds of them, many who had never met the Carters, walked shoulder to shoulder through fields holding sticks to part the tall grass. Every teacher was interviewed. Every parent who had been on school grounds that day was interviewed. Every maintenance worker, every delivery driver, every parent who had ever had so much as a disagreement with the school was quietly looked at and, one by one, cleared. The story made regional news within 48 hours, then national news within a week. A reward fund reached 6 figures within the first month, fueled by strangers moved by a photograph of a gap-toothed boy in a red raincoat. Phone records were pulled. Vehicles were checked against traffic camera footage on every road leading out of town. Sex offender registries within 100 miles were cross-referenced against school volunteer logs. And after all of it, after thousands of hours of manpower, hundreds of interviews, and a search radius that eventually stretched across 3 counties, investigators had exactly nothing solid to hold on to. No physical evidence. No confirmed sighting beyond the playground. No ransom demand. No body. Just a missing boy, a 4-minute gap in a security tape, and a community slowly beginning to understand that some cases don't resolve in the tidy way true crime stories often promise. Then, 3 weeks into the investigation, one witness came forward with something that changed everything. A woman walking her dog past the school fence line on the day Ethan disappeared remembered a man standing near the tree line at the edge of the playground. Not close enough to be suspicious at the time, not doing anything alarming, just standing there, watching in a way she hadn't thought twice about until she saw Ethan's photograph on the news. A man nobody else had noticed at all. The witness worked with a police sketch artist for nearly 3 hours, refining a composite image detail by detail. A man in his 40s, dark jacket, baseball cap pulled low, standing with his hands in his pockets near the fence line. When that sketch was released to the public, the town of quiet mornings and unlocked doors turned, almost overnight, into a town gripped by fear. Parents began walking their children to school in groups. Kindergarten enrollment for the spring semester dropped. Tip lines lit up with hundreds of calls. Men matching the description had allegedly been spotted at a gas station 2 towns over, at a diner off the highway, at a motel near the interstate. Detectives chased every one of them. 3 separate men were brought in for questioning based on the sketch alone. 2 were cleared within hours through simple alibi confirmation. The third, a delivery driver with a prior minor record, became the focus of intense scrutiny for nearly 2 weeks, until DNA evidence collected from a jacket fiber near the playground fence excluded him entirely. The case, which had briefly seemed to have direction, began to collapse again. And then came a twist that unsettled even the detectives who had seen everything. A forensic technician doing a routine deep dive on the school's server discovered that the corrupted 4-minute gap in the playground footage wasn't purely the result of a technical malfunction after all. Buried in the DVR's metadata was evidence that a portion of the file had been manually accessed and overwritten, not erased entirely, which would have been obvious, but selectively altered in a way that looked, to a casual glance, exactly like an ordinary system glitch. Someone with access to that server room, at some point, had deliberately tampered with the one piece of evidence that could have shown what happened to Ethan Carter. The question was no longer just who took him. It was who inside that school didn't want anyone to see. The revelation about the tampered footage sent investigators back through Maple Grove Kindergarten's records with a far more suspicious eye. What they found wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a school with more cracks in its foundation than anyone had realized. The school's finances were in worse shape than parents knew. A budget shortfall the previous year had forced cuts to maintenance staff, leaving a single part-time contractor responsible for security systems that used to be serviced by a full-time technician. Maintenance logs for the DVR system hadn't been properly filed in over 4 months. The fence line at the edge of the playground, the exact spot where the witness placed the mysterious stranger, had a documented, unrepaired gap that maintenance had flagged for repair twice without any follow-up. Staff tensions surfaced too. 2 teachers had filed internal complaints against the school's operations manager over unaddressed safety concerns in the months before Ethan disappeared. One kindergarten aide abruptly resigned less than 2 weeks after the disappearance, citing personal reasons, which, in a town primed for suspicion, instantly became its own rumor mill. Parents began quietly accusing staff members among themselves. A teacher's aide's home was vandalized after her name spread online incorrectly as a person of interest. The principal received threats. The town's grief had nowhere to go, and it began looking for someone, anyone, to blame. But as detectives dug deeper into every staff member with server room access, they hit the same wall over and over. The teacher who resigned had a documented alibi. She'd been in a parent conference across the building during the exact window in question, confirmed by 3 other staff members. The operations manager had been off-site at a district meeting. Every single staff member with technical access to that DVR system had a verified alibi for the 4-minute gap. None of them could have done it. It was on paper another dead end, one more door that opened onto an empty room. The case went cold. Truly cold. Weeks became months. Months became a year. The reward fund stopped growing. The news vans stopped coming. The volunteers, one by one, returned to their own lives, carrying Ethan Carter with them only as a photograph on a community bulletin board that slowly faded in the sun. For the Carters, the world moved on in a way that felt, some days, like its own kind of cruelty. Grief does not move in a straight line, and it does not move at the same speed for everyone who carries it. 2 years after Ethan disappeared, Daniel and Sarah Carter were, by any outside measure, still standing. But the marriage that had once felt effortless now carried a weight neither of them knew how to put down. Sarah had, slowly and painfully, begun to build something that resembled acceptance. Not peace, never peace, but a kind of forward motion. She had gone back to teaching piano. She had started, quietly, to talk about the idea of moving. A new house, a new town, a new set of walls that didn't have a small handprint pressed into the drywall beside a door frame. Measured every 6 months until the measuring simply stopped. Daniel could not do it. He kept Ethan's room exactly as it had been. He still bought a birthday cake every September, small and unshared, and he still sat with it alone at the kitchen table after Sarah had gone to bed, because some part of him refused to let a single year pass unmarked, as if marking it was the last thing keeping his son tethered to the world. "He's not gone until we know," Daniel would say, the same 6 words, again and again, whenever Sarah gently raised the subject of moving forward. It was not a fight exactly. It was 2 people grieving in 2 incompatible directions, both of them exhausted, both of them still, somehow, in love with each other and unable to find their way back to the same room. Then, on an ordinary rainy Tuesday evening in October, everything changed again. Daniel had recently reactivated an old tracking app on his phone, one he'd installed years earlier for his car keys and forgotten about, one that happened to still be linked to a small Bluetooth tag he'd once sewn into the strap of Ethan's dinosaur backpack, back before any of this began. He hadn't thought about that tag in 2 years. As far as anyone knew, the backpack itself had never been found, which is exactly why the notification made no sense at all. Device found. Ethan's backpack tag. Distance, 6 feet. Daniel called Sarah's name so loudly she came running from the bedroom, still holding a book she'd been reading, certain something was wrong. He held the phone out to her, his hand shaking. "It's Ethan's tag," he said. "It's here. It's inside the house." Sarah's first reaction was disbelief, quickly followed by something more frightening. Hope, sharp and sudden, the kind of hope that had nearly destroyed both of them a dozen times over 2 years of false leads and dead-end tips. They called the police immediately. Detective Marsh, who had worked the case from the beginning and had never quite let it go the way cold cases usually demand, arrived within 20 minutes along with a small forensics team. Nobody said it aloud, but everyone in that house was thinking the same impossible thought, that somehow, some way, this signal meant Ethan himself might be near. The tracker app placed the signal getting stronger as Daniel walked down the hallway. 3 feet, 2 feet. It led, exactly as it had the first time, to Ethan's bedroom, to the bed that had not been touched in 2 years. Daniel knelt down, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his ears, and looked underneath. What he found was not his son. It was a small, rusted metal box, wedged up against the wall, tucked behind the bed frame's back leg, in a space so tight it would have taken deliberate effort to place it there, and deliberate effort to retrieve it. The forensics team photographed everything before anyone touched it. When they finally pried the box loose and opened it under bright evidence lighting, the room went completely silent. Inside were 6 things. A handful of children's drawings, crayon dinosaurs, a stick figure family standing in front of a stick figure house, the kind of drawings that could have come from Ethan's own classroom folder. A small plastic kindergarten identification bracelet, the kind schools use for field trips, with E. Carter printed on it in faded marker. One small, worn child's shoe. A tiny Bluetooth tracking tag. The same model, investigators would soon confirm, as the one that had been sewn into Ethan's backpack strap. A USB flash drive. And a folded, handwritten letter and signed. Nobody in that room said a word for nearly a full minute. The fingerprints lifted from the box's interior were rushed to processing that same night, given the magnitude of the discovery. And when the results came back 48 hours later, they didn't point to a stranger from the tree line or a parent with a grudge, or any of the 100 names investigators had chased over 2 years. They belonged to someone who had been inside the investigation itself, a name that had been interviewed, cleared, and dismissed within the very first week. The fingerprints belonged to a man named Russell Voss, a contractor who had done part-time maintenance and security system work at Maple Grove Kindergarten for nearly 3 years before Ethan disappeared. The same contractor responsible for the aging DVR system that had gone unserviced for months, the same system with the mysterious 4-minute gap. Voss had been interviewed in the first week of the investigation, precisely because of his access to the security system. At the time, he provided a plausible account of routine maintenance work performed off-site that day, and with the department stretched thin chasing hundreds of leads, his statement was logged, filed, and set aside. What detectives now understood, piecing together the USB drive's contents alongside 2 years of dormant evidence, was a far darker picture. Voss had intimate, detailed knowledge of the fence line's unrepaired gap, a gap he himself had flagged for repair and then quietly left unfixed. On the day Ethan disappeared, investigators now believe Voss used that gap and his familiarity with the exact blind spot of the playground camera to approach Ethan during the unsupervised minutes of outdoor play. The USB drive recovered from the box contained planning notes, time-stamped observations of the school's routines over several weeks, and a chilling personal journal cataloging his movements, evidence that transformed a 2-year mystery into a documented timeline. The drive also explained the tampered footage. Voss had used his legitimate contractor access to the server room in the days following the disappearance to selectively overwrite the exact 4-minute window, disguising the alteration as an ordinary system glitch, a manipulation sophisticated enough to survive 1 round of forensic review, but not 2. As for the backpack tag, investigators believe Voss removed it from Ethan's backpack shortly after the disappearance, recognizing it as the single greatest risk to being traced, and hid it, along with a small collection of items connected to Ethan, inside the Carters' own home, in a location he correctly gambled no one would think to search a 3rd or 4th time. The underside of a bed that had become, in the family's grief, an untouchable memorial. 2 years later, an unrelated police visit to a different property Voss maintained, a routine call about a burglary at a nearby business, appears to have triggered a wave of panic. Investigators believe Voss returned to the Carter home that October evening intending to retrieve and destroy the box before any renewed scrutiny could reach him, using a spare key obtained during a legitimate maintenance visit years earlier that had never been returned. He was very likely still in the house, or had just left it when Daniel's reactivated tracking app caught the tag signal, inadvertently reactivated when Voss disturbed the box while trying to retrieve it, and then abandoned the attempt, panicking when he heard Daniel and Sarah moving inside the house. Within days, investigators secured search warrants for Voss's home and vehicle. Additional physical evidence, cross-referenced against the USB drive's timeline, led to his arrest. Faced with the accumulated weight of evidence, Voss ultimately confessed, though the full details of what happened to Ethan Carter after he was taken from that playground remain, even now, only partially resolved, pieced together from a confession that investigators continue to corroborate. The community that had once turned on its own teachers and neighbors was left to reckon with a much harder truth, that the danger had been hiding in plain sight, inside a role trusted enough to move freely through the building for years. The courtroom proceedings that followed were methodical and, at times, unbearably difficult to sit through. Prosecutors walked the jury through the reconstructed timeline, the flagged and ignored fence repair, the falsified maintenance logs, the deliberately corrupted security footage, the journal entries recovered from the USB drive that documented weeks of quiet observation before the day Ethan disappeared. Detective Marsh testified about the early missed opportunity to scrutinize Voss's alibi more closely, an admission that was difficult for the department and one that prompted an internal review of how contractor access to school security systems was vetted going forward. Sarah gave a statement to the court that many in the gallery would remember for years afterward. Not an account of anger, but of 2 years spent trying to hold a family together around an absence that had no shape and no answer. Daniel could not finish reading his own statement aloud. A victim's advocate finished it for him. In the aftermath, Maple Grove Kindergarten implemented sweeping safety reforms, redundant camera systems with tamper-proof, cloud-based storage, strict new vetting and access protocols for outside contractors, repaired and reinforced perimeter fencing, and a policy requiring 2 staff members to verify any changes made to security infrastructure. A small memorial garden was planted along the repaired fence line, with a plaque bearing Ethan's name and a single stone dinosaur footprint set into the path, a quiet nod to a boy who once stomped on sidewalk cracked for luck. Months after the arrest, Daniel walked into Ethan's room and, for the first time in over 2 years, did not stand frozen in the doorway. He sat down on the edge of the bed. He picked up the stuffed rabbit, brushed the dust from its fur, and held it for a long time. He did not get the ending he had spent 2 years hoping for. But for the first time since that Thursday morning in September, he had something that had felt impossible for so long. He had the truth. Some mysteries are not solved because of brilliant detective work alone. Sometimes they are solved because a grieving father refused to let go of a room nobody else could bear to enter, and because 2 years later, a small, forgotten piece of technology caught a signal it was never supposed to catch. Daniel Carter never found the ending he had prayed for on that first Thursday morning in September. But after 2 years of silence, he finally found something almost as important. He found the truth. And in finding it, he gave his son back a name that meant more than a missing poster ever could. A name attached, at last, to answers instead of questions. Do you think investigators missed warning signs at Maple Grove Kindergarten in those early weeks? What part of this investigation surprised you the most? And if you had been one of the detectives working this case from day one, what would you have done differently? If you appreciate carefully researched crime stories like this, that teaches us how investigations unfold, like and subscribe for more.